The Story Vault presents The Wagon Train, Episode 3, The Wounded Stranger. The air was still that morning, too still. The usual creak of wagon wheels and quiet murmur of voices had yet to begin, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Amos McGraw sat atop his horse, scanning the horizon with tired eyes. The river crossing had cost them, but the wagons had rolled on, weary but unbroken. Supplies were thin, tempers thinner, but the train kept moving westward through an expanse of rolling plains and distant jagged hills. Then, just as the sun began its slow crawl over the land, came the sound of hoofbeats. Not the steady rhythm of a scout returning, nor the charge of a raiding party. No, this was something different. Slow, uneven. A single rider slumped forward in his saddle, his horse moving at a weary trot, as if dragging a ghost behind it. Amos straightened, his gloved hand tightening on the reins. The rest of the train was stirring now, heads lifting, eyes narrowing against the morning light. Jim Carter stepped up beside his wagon, one hand instinctively finding the rifle resting inside. His wife, Liz, stood nearby, her expression tense, while their daughter, Rose Carter, stood at the edge of the camp, shielding her eyes as she squinted toward the stranger. The horse came closer, dust rising in its wake. The rider barely held himself in the saddle, swaying with each step. His hat hung low over his face, but as he neared, they could all see it, the dark stain spreading across his side. Then he slumped forward. The horse gave a tired snort, slowing to a halt just as the man tumbled to the ground in a lifeless heap. A hush fell over the camp. Dr. Eleanor Harper was the first to move. She rushed forward, kneeling beside the fallen man as Amos and Eli Warren dismounted. Jesse Blackwell, ever watchful, leaned against a wagon wheel, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised in mild curiosity. Eleanor pressed two fingers to the stranger's neck, searching, waiting, then exhaled. He's alive. The tension eased just slightly. The early morning light stretched across the camp, the first rays of the sun touching the edges of the plains. The smell of fresh earth mixed with the faint scent of smoke from the fire. But the stillness hung heavy in the air. A silence, broken only by the distant calls of birds and the crackling fire. Amos crouched beside her, studying the man's face. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, his skin sun-beaten and weathered. A thick, unkempt beard covered his jaw, and his clothes were ragged, stained with sweat and blood. Eleanor carefully peeled back his torn shirt, revealing the wound beneath. An arrow, half buried in his side, the shaft broken off, the edges caked in dried blood. She muttered a curse under her breath. This wound's at least a day old. He's burning up. At that moment, the man stirred, his head lolled to the side, his mouth opening as if to speak. Then, a whisper, barely audible. "They're coming!" Eleanor froze. So did Amos. Jim Carter stepped closer, rifle gripped tight. "Who's coming?" The man's breath hitched, his fingers twitching as he tried to grab at Amos's coat. His lips parted again, but no more words came, just a rasping wheeze before his head slumped back into unconsciousness. Silence. Then, Jesse Blackwell let out a slow sigh and shook his head. "See, this is why I don't stop for strays." Amos shot him a look but said nothing. His gaze returned to the horizon, scanning, searching. Nothing but the rolling plains and the whisper of wind. But something was out there, and it was coming. The camp was on edge. Amos ordered the stranger brought into one of the wagons, where Eleanor began working to remove the arrow. The others gathered around, voices low and uncertain. "This ain't our fight," Jim Carter muttered. "We don't even know what kind of trouble he's bringing." Liz Carter frowned, holding Rose close. "We can't just leave him." Amos stayed silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then finally, "We don't move till we know what we're dealing with." Jesse let out a dry chuckle. "And what if we're dealing with something meaner than we can handle?" Amos ignored him, but the words lingered. Something was coming, and they were running out of time. Night fell with an uneasy quiet. The fires burned low, and men took turns standing watch. The stranger still hadn't woken, though his fever burned high. Eleanor worked in silence, occasionally glancing out toward the darkened plains. Then, near midnight, Eli Warren, standing watch at the edge of camp, stiffened. A shadow moved in the distance, then another. Low figures barely visible in the darkness creeping along the ridgeline, watching. Eli's fingers tightened around his rifle. "They're here." The night air was thick with tension as Amos and the others gathered at the edge of the camp, eyes locked on the distant figures. Then, from the darkness, came a sound, a low whistle, sharp, purposeful, a signal. A moment later, the first shot rang out, and the night exploded into chaos. Who are the mysterious men hunting the dying stranger? Will the wagon train make it through the night? Don't miss the action. Subscribe and like to stay updated on the Wagon Train Episode 4, The Standoff.